Okay, so I'm going to talk about hype cycles of the digital economy. Now, it's actually was very nice seeing Brian Wynn here. So when I started my PhD with Brian at Lancaster, hype was a big thing because we had the birth of the internet. But the interesting thing about hype back in 1995 was that it was accelerating, random, but it was never a cycle. So the idea of that, hype has become a cycle is a fairly kind of recent phenomena, at least maybe just 20 years. And I mean, I don't need to say much to this audience about, what this is, because you all know what this is, right? This is the Gartner hype cycle, okay? So, and in a way, it's become emblematic of the sociology of expectations. It's almost built on giving a theorization of this object. So you can't do sociology of expectations without knowing what this is. So what I want to do is maybe push back a bit on how the sociology of expectations characterize the hype cycle and offer a kind of not alternative, but a different kind of interpretation of what it is and what it does and why it's been so successful. And one of the things that people often say about the hype cycle is that it's a theory or a cultural resource, and or it's helped bring in this idea of hype cycle thinking. But it's much more than that. And probably importantly, the key thing about the Gartner hype cycle is that it's a product. Okay, so it's not just a theory of how innovations emerge and are overhyped. It's actually a working product. So there are literally 200 different hype cycles in operation at the moment where different kinds of technologies are mapped at different phases of the hype cycle. So it's kind of out there doing its work. So sociology of expectations has established this idea of hype cycle thinking. So it's been successful in giving an account of how we now we see it, we know what it is because it's a kind of cultural resource, or it's a folk theory that's used in industry and also in academia. But the key thing about the hype cycle that's not talked about is how it's transformed, particularly technology adoption. And in doing that, it's transforming also the digital economy. So it's very much a transformative object as well as a theory. And you kind of all already know a little bit about hype cycles, and you know that on the one hand, they're negative. So if a technology goes through a hype cycle, it can ruin its reputation. But Harro van Lente told us or taught us that hype cycles are also quite positive for innovation because they generate excitement, they get people mobilized, they bring finances to innovation. So they also can be performative or generative for innovation. Now, recently, some economic sociologists, Jens Beckert in particular, has taken this idea and says hype cycles are not just generative for innovation, they also generate the economy. So the whole economy is based on hype cycles. And he draws on the work of early economists, talking about how when we calculate in the economy, when we can't calculate because of uncertainty, animal spirits, hype cycles, excitement or fear, make us make choices, decisions. So this generates the whole economy. Now, so one of the arguments that we have in the paper is that colleagues in expectations haven't really studied the hype cycles. It's quite an interesting object. So if you actually look at it, you'll see that it's two curves. So on the left hand, there's a bell curve, and on the right, there's an S curve. So in a way, this is where all the excitement and fear, the animal spirits that Beckert talks about are on this side, but on the other side, there's this kind of calculation where technologies begin to come into this side where you can make assessments about their performance. So you get this nice kind of balance between these animal spirits and these calculative rationalities. So what our argument is that the hype cycle is changing the way key actors in the economy, technology adopters and investors, the way in which they approach hype. And in doing that, it's also influencing the dynamics of the digital economy. And the idea of this is that the main kind of goal behind it, so this is constructed not for academics to critique, it's constructed for technology adopters to move them from a kind of wait and see approach, when things are highly uncertain, they want to shift them from that uncertainty to be able to act. So that's the goal, that's the target audience. And so what they do is they plot various technologies on here. And as I said, there's 200 of these in circulation. And what I want to show you is how they do it. So how do they enact this nice diagram for all of these different technologies? And I'll show you some of the processes. But also, as you can imagine, there's quite a few difficulties as well. So it often takes various kinds of acts of remedying to make the cycle perform in the way in which they want it to do. And the whole idea of a cycle is actually quite interesting as well, because we tend to think about, well, maybe we don't. We don't really question, that cycles are not natural or, they have their own rhythm. These are something which are created by different actors. So there's been kind of calls from a variety of people. This is someone looking at housing cycles to, look at what causes cycles. How do you make or create cyclical thinking, and how do you, create the ups and downs of the economy? So we had a very kind of simple kind of method. We just, we got as many Gartner analysts as possible on the phone, and we said to them, well, how do you do it? How do you actually know when a technology is moving along this curve? What do you do? What's the evidence? And how do you actually move it along the curve? How far do they go? And what goes wrong? What's the difficulties of actually trying to plot this thing? And then they told us what these things were. So I'm going to talk about just 3 processes, what they attempt to do, and in terms of how they redefine hype. So the very initial starting process is that they're hypercritical. For every technology that's launched, they start with an idea. This is massively hyped. It's overhyped. No matter what it is, that's their starting assumption. And they tell their clients, the technology adopter, be really cautious, okay? This is over-enthusiastic. It's not justified. Take blockchain. Yeah, blockchain is not going to work. It's all massively hyped, okay? So they start from this assumption. Things are massively overhyped. Then, from there, they move to a second phase where they begin to chart a pathway for the adopter through this hype. And here, technology is now going over the top and down into here. And they divide up technology adopters into 3 categories, A, B, and C, according to how they can support risk. And they begin to say, you're a type A, you can probably adopt here. You're a type B, you adopt here. And you're a type C, you wait to here. So they begin to provide these kind of pathways through the hype for the adopter. Now, internally, it's actually quite interesting about how they decide how to move the dots. And the biggest fear they have as an analyst is that they become enamored with the technology. So these people make enormous career investments in understanding technology, and they like it, okay? And they can be like the client, taken in by the hype, okay? They can't, they're taken in by the vendor rhetoric. They don't see past vendor claims, and they become blinded as well to the technology, and they don't understand this impact. Okay, so the individual can become enamored by the technology. Now, to get round that, all of the hype cycles are plotted by a collective. So if you think on the hype cycle, it has an author, maybe 2 or 3 analysts, but each of the dots, there's 40 dots, 40 technologies, all belong to different analysts. So they have to get all those people together into a call and negotiate where the dots go, okay? And that can be, so these people recount, yeah, I'll talk to the guy who does human capital, I'll talk to the guy who does management systems, I'll talk to this guy and that guy, and we agree, okay? Other times you could be 400 people in a meeting on a Zoom call saying, my dot should be here, no, it should be there, et cetera, et cetera. And all of them said it's haggling, okay, and providing evidence and countering each other. So it's very much like an encounter to work out this positioning. Okay, and the really interesting thing about it is when it doesn't work, okay, so when, what's the problems, this is what we're saying to them, tell us when it goes wrong, okay, and the things they say, well, often they're too fast, okay, we make hype cycles that are too fast, and what they mean by that is that their client, the tech adopter, is deciding whether to make an investment, but they've produced a hype cycle with a dot, it's too far to one end, okay, and they're saying it's more mature than it is. And these clients will invest, but the technology is still immature and fails. And so the clients get very angry, they complain, etc. And so they have various kind of acts of remedying when they make mistakes. They go too far across the cycle. Things they can't do, they can't go backwards. So you move a dot too far, you can't move it backwards. In this case, you just let the market catch up. So they're too fast. They can also be too slow. So in this case, where these people, they make these investments in their career to study technologies. Now they will fight to have their technology on the hype cycle. They really want to be on there because they're being visible in the market. And you get this problem called perennial favorites, that all these people are fighting to get their technology onto the market, and no other technology can get on. There's no space for nothing else, okay? Because they're all blocked by the existing technologies. And so this guy's talking about for 13 years, he couldn't get any new technologies onto the hype cycle because there are all these perennial favorites just taking up all the space, right? And that's a problem because for the tech adopter, okay, you're not telling them what's the latest technology. They're getting this kind of old stuff. So the acts of remedying is to give all the dots a shelf life. So they can only be on the hype cycle for a certain number of years. Now you can imagine what that does to the market, okay? So the market gets quite excited with these hype cycles. It kind of follows them getting more mature, but suddenly they disappear. They're taken off. It must be something's gone wrong. Maybe it's failing, okay? So they become disinterested. So another example of being too slow is where you get, it's an example where the hype cycle's slow, but the technology's fast, and they have this thing called fast movers. So these are technologies which go so quickly through all the phases that it'll move through the whole hype cycle before they've really published the next version, okay? So it's gone from one stage to another too quickly. And that's a problem because they're not keeping their clients up to date, okay? They're missing out on gaining opportunities. And so one of the things they're trying to do is thinking about, can we create kind of living hype cycles? So instead of producing them once a year, okay, they'll have things which are kind of live, updated more regularly, so they actually represent these kind of fast movers who are going through too quickly. And my last example is when you get the example of too crowded, okay? So you get too many dots onto the hype cycle. And this happens because behind each dot is what we call an innovation profile, and these are kept in a database. So the idea is you go there as analysts and say, okay, I'm going to construct one, I'll construct these innovation profiles. But increasingly what they do is they rather than construct their own innovation profiles, they go into the database and put them onto the hype cycle. And because there's so many on there, they'll put more and more onto the hype cycle. So these hype cycles become crowded. And so they're like, it looks like a string of pearls. It's really kind of impressive, isn't it, all these technologies. But for the adopter, they're looking at this, they can't make sense of it. There's too much. There's too much choice. There's no clear path of way to act or decide. So what the act of remedying this time was to either take the dots off or split the hype cycles, okay? So you create 2 or 3 more new hype cycles. So again, you think of the industry, okay? So every time a hype cycle is launched, it creates excitement. There's a new area, a new industry being created, right? So you think there's a new kind of innovation. But these are being split based on this kind of visual aesthetic and being launched into the market and creating this excitement. Okay, so just to kind of close and give you some thoughts on why we think the hype cycle is interesting. And so you can see how they're bringing together 2 different perspectives. So you've got this kind of caution, they're showing these kind of hopeful monstrosities, and there's a wait and see. And on the other hand, there's a kind of more optimistic, almost like an investor perspective. They're trying to encourage the adopter to become like an investor, right? And so what they do is they purposely produce this friction between these 2 forms of assessment, these 2 different forms of assessment, and they create this friction between these 2 things. And in a way, this is a bit like, they go back to the work of Beckett. So Beckett would say that hype is helpful for the economy because it blocks situations when people can't act, okay? So it creates a kind of animal spirits, the excitement, the fear. And what the hype cycle does instead, it does both those things in one space. So it's doing 2 things in one space. It's actually not just one impulse of excitement or fear, it's actually eliciting these kind of contrasting impulses, both the animal spirits and this kind of more calculative rationalities. Now, going back to kind of Beckert's kind of question, so he's saying that, this is the foundations of the economy. So hype cycles are really important because it's what the economy is based on. And they're propelling these kind of cyclical movements. But there's often a kind of self-evidence around hype cycles. We tend to assume, that every time there's an innovation is launched, they naturally occur. And that's obviously not the case from what I've been showing you. Or that hype cycles are kind of natural attribute of markets, or they have their own kind of rhythm, and that's really not the case. And so one of the things we're trying to do is trying to kind of talk about some of the contours of hype cycles, how you can differentiate different kinds. And so on one hand, you've got these kind of unbridled, almost wild hype cycles which grow out in the market, in people talking about overhyping technologies that emerge from innovation communities. On the other hand, you've got this other kind, which is kind of more tamed, organized hype cycle, which is created by these market actors. We keep them in circulation purposefully for the benefit of these actors who are the tech adopters. And what they're trying to do by trying to work out, not have them too fast or too slow or too crowded, is have to give hype cycles, a particular kind of temporal and spatial structure. Okay, and this is my last point. So, going back to how I started, is that when you read any of the sociology of expectations, it's kind of interesting how their take on the hype cycle. They're often quite critical, and I've often been wondered, why is that? And surprised at that particular account. To talk about the fact it can be as a model of innovation, it's actually not very good. And they point out the kind of inconsistencies in the way it works. But actually, if you think about it as a theory of innovation, it doesn't make sense. But if you think about it as a promissory product, it makes perfect sense, because what they're trying to do is, they're not trying to map innovation. They're building something for their client, the consumers. It's always constructed with their consumer in mind. It's them they're making it for. And so what they want to do is taking dots off, putting dots on, splitting them for the client, not to track innovation. And just last slide. And so Rob and I have been talking about, so we can map the hype cycle. So where do you take that? What do you do next? And we would argue that you can, once you start looking for hype tools, there's quite a few out there, particularly digital ones. You can see quite a few. You think of, for example, Google Trends or some of the stock market tools, which are precisely about trying to map hype. And also, the other thing they're doing is quantifying hype as well, which is kind of interesting. So they found a way to quantify hype, although the hype cycle is not a full quantification. It's mostly qualitative, but there's kind of quantitative elements in there. And you can think about it, there's this term from the kind of org studies field called, multimodal. It's like a multimodal accomplishment where it's bringing together different modes of ordering. So you've got the visual, you've got the numbers, and you've got a variety of other things as well, including the kind of the commodity nature of it, and they're interfacing with each other. Okay, and that's me finished.